At 10:15 a.m. on April 9, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokrishkin climbed into the cockpit of his P-39 Era Cobra at a forward airbase near Krimskaya in southern Russia, preparing for what would become his first combat victory in a plane that many believed was useless. The fighter was American-made, shipped across 2 oceans, disliked by British pilots, rejected by American squadrons, and dismissed as worthless by nearly every Western Air Force that flew it. Just 24 hours earlier, Pokrishkin's commanding officer had told him that the new fighters were coming soon, part of the Lend-Lease deliveries from the United States. The British had tested them and refused to keep them. The Americans had used them briefly in the Pacific and were already replacing them with better aircraft. Now these unwanted planes were being sent to Russia, and Soviet pilots were expected to face the Luftwaffe with them. Pokrishkin had flown the Yak-1 and MiG-3 for 2 years. Both were solid Soviet designs and could hold their own against German Messerschmitts, but both had issues. Radios that barely worked, guns that jammed, engines that failed at terrible moments. The new American P-39 had a reputation that reached Russia long before it arrived. British pilots called it a death trap. American pilots in New Guinea said it could not climb, could not turn with a zero, and could not intercept bombers above 15,000 feet. One American joke said the P-400, the export version, was just a P-39 with a zero chasing it. The aircraft had one major design flaw that ruined its chances in Western Air Forces. During development in 1938, the prototype had a turbocharger that allowed excellent high-altitude performance. The XP-39 first flew on April 6, 1938, reaching 390 mph at 20,000 feet and climbing to that altitude in only 5 minutes. But in June 1939, the Army Air Corps ordered the prototype sent to NACA wind tunnels to reduce drag and improve speed. Engineers found the turbocharger installation caused too much drag. In August 1939, Bell Aircraft suggested removing the turbocharger entirely and replacing it with a simple, single-stage, single-speed supercharger. This decision completely destroyed the P-39's high-altitude performance. Above 15,000 feet, the engine struggled for air, and its power dropped sharply. By 20,000 feet, the plane was nearly helpless. For American and British Air Forces planning to escort bombers at 25,000 feet or higher, this was unacceptable. RAF pilots tested the P-400 in late 1941 and rejected it immediately. They reported the plane was inferior to both the Spitfire and Hurricane at real combat altitudes. Worse, it had a dangerous habit of falling into flat spins with little warning. The center of gravity was too far back because the engine was positioned behind the pilot. Once the 37mm nose cannon fired and its ammunition was used up. Once the nose cannon's ammunition was spent, the aircraft became tail-heavy. Several British pilots nearly lost their lives when their Airacobras entered spins that were almost impossible to recover from. The Americans had similar experiences. In early 1942, P-39s and P-400s were deployed to stop the Japanese advance across the Pacific. Squadrons flew them at Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and across New Guinea. Pilots quickly learned what the British already knew. The P-39 could not intercept Japanese bombers flying at 20,000 feet. It could not climb fast enough to reach them, and when it finally did gain altitude, it no longer had the power to fight. American pilots said the aircraft felt heavy and sluggish above 15,000 feet, as if it were flying through thick mud. Controls responded slowly, speed dropped off, and Japanese Zeros could easily outmaneuver them at high altitude. Lieutenant Evan Stevens of the 39th Fighter Squadron flew P-39s in New Guinea. He later described how frustrating the aircraft was. It looked dangerous, with its sleek shape and cannon in the nose, but it simply could not meet the needs of combat in the Pacific. In one battle over Leh in April 1942, Stevens's unit scrambled to intercept an incoming Japanese raid. They climbed hard, pushing their Allison engines to full power. By the time they reached 15,000 feet, they could see the bombers still 5,000 feet above them. The P-39 struggled to climb any further. The rate of ascent had nearly stopped. The Zeros saw them and dove to attack. Stevens's wingman got pulled into a turning battle at 18,000 feet. The P-39 handled poorly in the turn, sliding and losing speed. The Zero flipped around and got behind him. Stevens watched his wingman's plane trail smoke as it went down. And the problems didn't end with altitude performance. The 37mm M4 cannon mounted in the nose, firing through the propeller hub, looked terrifying on paper. In practice, it jammed constantly. The cannon's slow firing rate, only about 3 shots per second, combined with its heavy, slow shell, made hitting moving targets extremely difficult. Pilots said the cannon often fired just 2 or 3 rounds before jamming, leaving them to rely on machine guns alone. On some missions, P-39s took off with their cannons, completely unusable because ground crews could not keep them. Working in the heat and moisture of the jungle, the 30 caliber machine guns in the wings were too weak to do real damage against Japanese aircraft. Only the 250 caliber guns in the nose had enough stopping power, but 2 guns weren't enough. By late 1942, American pilots in the Pacific were calling the P-39 the Iron Dog, and most requested transfers to P-38 squadrons as soon as they could. By December, the 5th Air Force had claimed roughly 80 Japanese aircraft shot down, but it had lost nearly as many P-39s in return. About the same number of P-39s had been lost. The kill ratio was roughly 1-1 at best. For an Air Force that needed to gain air superiority against experienced Japanese pilots, this simply wasn't acceptable. The only American pilot to become an ace while flying the P-39 was Second Lieutenant William Fiedler. Between January and June 1943, Fiedler shot down 5 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. His third kill came on June 12th, when he downed a Zero 10 miles from Cape Esperance. 4 days later, when 38 Zeros escorted 50 Val dive bombers toward American transports off Guadalcanal, Fiedler shot down 2 of the Vals, becoming the only P-39 ace in U.S. service. 2 weeks after that, on June 30th, 1943, Fiedler was killed on the ground when a P-38 Lightning, suffering engine failure during takeoff, crashed into his parked P-39 while he was seated in its cockpit. Both aircraft exploded. Fiedler was pulled from the burning wreck unconscious and died shortly afterward. He never lived to see his unique place in American aviation history. His death seemed to symbolize the P-39's reputation among U.S. forces. Even the plane's only ace died because of it, killed not by the enemy, but in an accident that likely wouldn't have occurred had he been flying a different aircraft. By the middle of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were phasing out P-39s as soon as newer fighters arrived. P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s replaced them in frontline roles. The remaining P-39s were moved to training duties or lesser theaters. The fighter had failed in nearly every role the Americans required. This should have been the end of its story. A promising design ruined by one critical engineering change, rejected by the services that requested it, remembered only as a lesson in why essential components should not be removed to save weight. But in Russia, the story changed. The air war on the Eastern Front wasn't fought at high altitude. When the first P-400s arrived at Murmansk on Arctic convoys in late 1941, Soviet pilots did not expect much. They had heard the aircraft were rejects, hand-me-downs unwanted by the British. The first Soviet test flights confirmed the warnings about its spin behavior. Test pilots intentionally tried to induce the flat spin problem and succeeded immediately. The aircraft would whip into a brutal flat spin, with almost no warning if flown with an empty nose ammunition bay. The demonstration shocked American observers, who claimed they had never been able to produce such a spin in the United States. But the Soviet pilots also noticed something else. Below 15,000 feet, the P-39 was excellent. The Allison engine produced strong power at low and medium altitudes. The aircraft was faster than most Soviet fighters under 12,000 feet. It rolled sharply and handled responsively. It could turn tightly, roll quickly, and offered excellent visibility from its bubble canopy. Most importantly, it had something Soviet fighters desperately lacked: a reliable radio. The SCR-522 radio in the P-39 was clear, powerful, and consistently dependable. Soviet pilots could communicate during flight, coordinate attacks, warn each other of incoming threats, and maintain formation discipline. This was a breakthrough for the VVS, where most fighters either had no radios or ones that barely worked. Now pilots could hear each other as clearly as if speaking side by side, share information instantly about enemy movements, adjust tactics in real time, and avoid surprise attacks. The P-39's firepower was also significant. The 37mm cannon, while troublesome for American ground crews, worked more reliably in Soviet service because maintenance teams focused heavily on ensuring the guns functioned correctly. The M4 cannon fired a large shell, capable of destroying an enemy aircraft with a single hit. Although the slow rate of fire, about 3 rounds per second, bothered American pilots who tried firing at maneuvering targets, Soviet pilots adapted. They trained to close in to shorter distances before firing, improving accuracy. They learned the exact lead angles needed for the cannon's heavy trajectory. With practice, the weapon's quirks became manageable. The 2 nose-mounted 50-caliber machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller, had a much higher rate of fire and were easier to use. Soviet pilots used them to walk their bullets onto the target before delivering a finishing shot with the cannon. Together, these weapons gave the P-39 the most powerful forward-facing armament of any Soviet fighter of the war. Typical Soviet aircraft had 1 or 2 cannons plus machine guns, but the P-39's blend of a heavy cannon and large caliber machine guns was uniquely destructive. Soviet pilots quickly removed the wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns to save weight and improve maneuverability. These guns and their ammunition added around 60 pounds. Removing them shifted the aircraft's center of gravity slightly forward, improving balance. More importantly, reducing weight at the wingtips decreased rotational inertia, increasing roll rate. With the wing guns gone, the aircraft became lighter, easier to maintain, and more agile. The adjustment was so effective that Soviet pilot Nikolai Golodnikov later recalled, "We removed the wing machine guns immediately, leaving 1 cannon and 2 machine guns." That modification improved roll rate by reducing rotational inertia. The cockpit was very comfortable, and the visibility was excellent. The instrument panel was well laid out, with all gauges easily readable, including an artificial horizon and a radio compass. Soviet mechanics also modified other systems based on pilot feedback. Some units adjusted control cable tension to make the controls more responsive. Others improved the oxygen system for better high-altitude operation, though this mattered less since combat usually occurred at lower levels. The fuel system was also adapted for more reliable cold weather starting, which was critical during Russian winters. Each of these field modifications was small on its own, but together they made the aircraft significantly better suited to conditions on the Eastern Front. The difference compared to American maintenance practices was striking. American ground crews worked strictly by technical manuals. Any modification required official engineering authorization. Field improvisation was discouraged or outright forbidden. This approach made sense for aircraft using well-supplied bases with proper logistics, but it prevented the sort of practical improvements that Soviet crews made routinely. Soviet mechanics had far more freedom to adjust the aircraft based on real combat experience. Their modifications were not always documented or officially approved, but they were effective. Most importantly, the tactical environment on the Eastern Front played to nearly all of the P-39's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Air combat between German and Soviet forces in 1943 occurred mostly between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Ground attack units flew low. Fighter cover stayed at medium altitude. The massive tank battles and artillery engagements typical of the Eastern Front meant aircraft spent much of their time supporting ground operations at altitudes where the P-39 performed best. Unlike the Pacific or Western Europe, where bombers operated above 20,000 feet, German bombers in the East usually flew below 15,000 feet during strikes. Stuka dive bombers attacked at very low altitude. Ju-88 level bombers rarely flew above 12,000 feet. Their fighter escorts stayed within similar altitude bands. This allowed Soviet P-39 pilots to fight exactly where their aircraft excelled. Between 8,000 and 15,000 feet, the P-39 could outrun early Bf-109 models, compete evenly with later ones, and remain competitive against all but the newest FW-190s. The aircraft's sturdy airframe allowed it to absorb significant battle damage and still return home. The armor around the cockpit was thick and protected the pilot well. Soviet pilots soon grew deeply attached to the aircraft they affectionately called Kobushka, dear little cobra, or Cobra Lastochka, a mix of cobra and swallow. Their affection was real. Just getting these aircraft to the Soviet Union was a major effort in itself. P-39s bound for Russia were built at Bell Aircraft's factory in Wheatfield, New York. From there, they were flown to Great Falls, Montana. Often, this leg was flown by female pilots of the Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, who ferried the aircraft across the United States. At Great Falls, male U.S. pilots took over and flew the fighters northwest to Fairbanks or Nome, Alaska, crossing thousands of miles of remote wilderness. But the truly dangerous part came next. At Alaskan airfields, the aircraft were handed over to Soviet pilots, who would fly them across the Bering Sea to Siberia. This Alaska-Siberia route, known as Alsib, was one of the most hazardous supply lines of the entire war. Soviet pilots flew single-seat fighters in groups, escorted by twin-engine transports or bombers that provided navigation and emergency support. They crossed huge stretches of open ocean, where a single engine failure meant certain death in freezing waters. Weather was brutal, storms could form suddenly, and navigation was extremely difficult with almost no landmarks. Many pilots were lost, vanishing into the Arctic without a trace. Those who survived landed at airfields in eastern Siberia, where the aircraft were refueled, inspected, and prepared for the next stage. From there, the P-39s continued westward across Siberia to assembly depots, and finally to frontline air regiments. The journey from New York to a Soviet fighter unit took weeks and covered more than 7,000 miles. Every P-39 that reached combat units had already endured an extraordinary journey. Alexander Pokryshkin became the leading figure associated with the P-39 in Soviet service. By early 1943, he already had nearly 20 victories flying MiG-3s and Yak-1s. He was aggressive, thoughtful, and constantly studied tactics to gain an edge over German pilots. When his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, converted to P-39s in January 1943, Pokryshkin committed himself to mastering the new aircraft. He spent weeks training behind the lines, learning its strengths and weaknesses, and developing new tactics specifically suited to it. One of his major innovations was the bookshelf formation. Pokryshkin positioned his fighters in stacked altitude layers, each layer supporting the one below it, each with a specific task. If an enemy escaped the first layer, the second intercepted. If the second engaged, the third layer provided cover. This formation required precise timing and excellent communication, something only the P-39's reliable radio allowed. Pokryshkin also introduced the use of ground-based radar coordination. The 4th Air Army received its first mobile radar systems in the summer of 1942. Pokryshkin worked closely with radar operators to develop intercept procedures in which controllers guided fighters by radio toward German formations before visual contact. The method worked extremely well, allowing Soviet pilots to surprise German aircraft from ideal positions. On April 9, 1943, Pogrishkin flew his first combat mission in the P-39. 8 Airacobras intercepted a German formation over Krimskaya. Messerschmitt Bf-109s were attacking Soviet LAG-3s. Pogrishkin dove from above, selected a Bf-109 and opened fire with all guns. The 37mm shells walked across the German fighter's fuselage. The engine burst apart, debris scattered, and the fighter rolled over and fell, trailing smoke. It was his first victory in the P-39. 3 days later, on April 12th, Pogrishkin shot down 4 Bf-109s in a single battle near Anapa. He used the bookshelf formation, coordinating every move, using the P-39's radio to place each pilot where they were needed. The German fighters tried to break and counterattack, but the Soviet formation shifted instantly. Pogrishkin's flight maintained altitude advantage, controlled the engagement, and shot down 4 enemy aircraft without losing a single plane. Between April 9th and April 30th, 1943, Pogrishkin scored 12 victories in the P-39. Other pilots in his regiment were achieving similar results. The tactics were spreading, and the successes were impossible to ignore. On April 29, 1943, one of the most famous engagements took place. 8 P-39 Airacobras, including Pogrishkin, were guided by ground radar toward a large German formation. 3 full squadrons of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were being escorted by a group of Bf-109s. The Soviets attacked from above. 2 P-39s engaged the escorts, while the remaining 6 repeatedly dove through the bomber formation. The fight lasted only minutes, but it was disastrous for the Germans. 12 German aircraft were shot down. Pogrishkin claimed 5 himself. Not a single Soviet aircraft was lost. This level of success had been rare earlier in the war. On May 24, 1943, Pogrishkin was awarded his first Hero of the Soviet Union medal. By June, he was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. He traded his P-39K-1 for a newer P-39N, aircraft number 100. Marked with white numbers, this would be his main aircraft for the rest of the war. The Germans quickly noticed the change. Luftwaffe pilots on the Eastern Front reported by mid-1943 that Soviet fighters were fighting differently, more aggressive, better coordinated, harder to ambush. Intelligence reports described American-built fighters with heavy nose armament, fast at low altitude, always flying in disciplined groups with excellent radio control. Grigory Rechkalov, flying as Pogrishkin's wingman in the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, became another P-39 master. Rechkalov had an unusual background. He was colorblind, something that normally should have disqualified him from flying. He hid his condition throughout training and the early war. On July 26, 1941, during a combat sortie, Rechkalov's I-16 was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He was wounded in the right leg, but still managed to land the damaged aircraft. Surgeons saved his leg, but he spent months recovering. He returned to duty in April 1942 and continued flying despite his color vision problems. Rechkalov began the war flying I-16s and I-153s, earning only modest success. But when the regiment switched to P-39s, everything changed. The aircraft suited his bold flying style perfectly. By the end of 1942, Rechkalov had 4 individual victories and 2 shared. By May 1943, after just 2 months flying the P-39 over Kuban, he had 12 solo victories and 2 shared. The aircraft had transformed his effectiveness in combat. On May 24, 1943, the same day Pogrishkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award, Rechkalov received his as well. Both men flew P-39s, and both scored most of their wartime victories in American-built fighters. Rechkalov eventually scored 44 of his 56 confirmed victories in P-39s. Most of those came in 2 particular aircraft that he flew for long periods, P-39D, serial number 428747, and P-39Q-15, serial number 442547. He marked both planes with his initials RGA on the tail. Soviet mechanics cared for these aircraft carefully. Rechkalov developed a close personal relationship with them, knew their handling deeply, trusted their reliability, and pushed them to the limit in combat. He survived being shot down, wounded several times, and even one disastrous engagement on May 31st, 1944, where 5 P-39s were lost after he pursued enemy aircraft alone instead of holding formation. Even so, he continued to fly the Airacobra, continued scoring victories, and continued proving that the aircraft rejected by Americans could excel in the right hands and the right tactical circumstances. By June 1943, several other Soviet pilots were scoring outstanding results with P-39s. Nikolai Gulayev scored 32 of his 57 victories in Airacobras. Gulayev was known for extremely aggressive tactics and excellent marksmanship. He preferred to close to very short range before firing, making full use of the P-39's powerful forward armament. His method was risky but extremely effective. Gulayev was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union twice and survived the war despite being shot down several times. Dmitry Glinka scored 50 victories, most of them in P-39s. Glinka flew with the 100th Guards Fighter. He flew in the 100th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment and was known for a careful, methodical style of combat. Unlike some aces who relied mainly on instinct and sheer aggression, Glinka studied enemy pilots, looking for patterns and weaknesses. He kept detailed notes on German tactics and shared his findings with his squadron. His analytical approach fit perfectly with Pokrishkin's tactical innovations. Glinka was seriously wounded on July 15, 1944, when he bailed out of his badly damaged Airacobra and struck the tailplane during the jump. He survived, but needed months to recover. Alexander Klubb scored 31 of his 50 victories in American-built fighters. Klubb had also been part of the May 31, 1944, battle in which Rechkalov's formation lost 5 P-39s. Despite that setback, Klubb continued flying Airacobras and kept achieving strong results throughout 1944. His experience showed that even in difficult engagements against newer German fighters, skilled P-39 pilots could survive and win. Another notable P-39 pilot was Ivan Babak, who scored 33 victories, most of them in Cobras. Babak was known for his exceptional eyesight and ability to spot enemy aircraft long before others did. Combined with the P-39's reliable radio, this made him the perfect early warning scout for his unit. Babak would detect German formations at long range, report their position, and guide his flight into favorable attack positions. His value went far beyond his own victory count. A clear pattern had emerged. Half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces scored most of their victories in P-39s. This was not a coincidence or a statistical fluke. It reflected a fundamental reality about how effective the aircraft was in Soviet service. The success came from matching the aircraft's capabilities to the mission it was used for. The Soviet Union received 4,719 P-39s through Lend-Lease, making it more than one-third of all American and British aircraft supplied to the USSR. Nearly half of all P-39s produced went to Russia. These aircraft were flown constantly, maintained under harsh conditions, and used in near-continuous combat. Soviet Airacobra losses were 1,030. Aircraft between 1942 and 1945, 49. Lost in 1942, 305. In 1943, 486. In 1944, 190. In 1945. Losses rose as the war intensified and Soviet forces pushed westward, facing stronger Luftwaffe defenses and newer fighters like the FW-190 and late-model Bf-109s. But Soviet P-39 victories grew even faster. By mid-1943, their kill ratio was decisively positive. They were shooting down more German aircraft than they were losing. This was the opposite of early war trends, when Soviet fighters often traded one for one, or worse, against the Luftwaffe. German pilots soon began to recognize and fear certain Soviet air units. When Pokrishkin's regiment was transferred to operations over Ukraine, Luftwaffe radio operators would warn their pilots whenever he was airborne. Pokrishkin used the radio call sign Sotka, meaning 100, the number painted on his aircraft. German pilots learned quickly that hearing Sotka on the radio meant Pokrishkin was in the sky. Some Luftwaffe squadrons were even ordered to avoid taking off if radio intelligence confirmed he was flying. This was unprecedented. One Soviet pilot, flying an American fighter that Western air forces had dismissed, was causing German units to avoid combat. German after-action reports from mid-1943 through late 1944 show a consistent trend. Luftwaffe pilots reported increasing difficulty winning engagements against Soviet fighters. They specifically noted American-built aircraft with distinctive shapes and tightly coordinated tactics. German intelligence attempted to understand what had changed. They inspected crashed P-39s recovered from Soviet territory and documented the modifications Soviet mechanics had made. Removed wing guns, adjusted control surfaces, modified radios. Yet German analysts could not explain how such minor changes led to major tactical improvements. The true advantage was not in the parts themselves, but in what the modifications represented. Soviet pilots and mechanics working together to tailor the aircraft to their exact combat needs. This type of field-level innovation was rare in the Luftwaffe, where any change required approval from centralized engineering commands. Soviet units could test modifications, observe results, and implement improvements in a matter of days. German units needed weeks or even months to make similar adjustments. German tactical responses evolved throughout late 1943 and 1944. Some pilots tried avoiding P-39 formations entirely, waiting to catch isolated Soviet aircraft instead. This cautious strategy contradicted earlier Luftwaffe doctrine and reduced overall German effectiveness. Other pilots tried to attack aggressively to break Soviet coordination, but without a performance advantage, aggression only got them killed faster. Several experienced Luftwaffe aces died in 1944, using tactics that had worked perfectly in 1942 against less capable Soviet fighters. The psychological effect was enormous. For almost 2 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated Soviet airspace. German pilots flew with confidence, certain that their aircraft were superior and their tactics unmatched. Now that confidence was fading. Veteran aces with dozens of kills were being shot down by Soviet pilots flying American-built fighters. Tactics that had worked reliably for 2 years were suddenly failing. The reasons were difficult for German intelligence to explain. The aircraft looked identical to the ones Americans had flown. The engines were the same. The armament was similar. But Soviet pilots used the P-39 differently, coordinated more effectively, and almost always seemed to have better information. What the Germans could not see were the subtle mechanical changes and the tactical innovations the Soviets had developed. Removing the wing guns improved roll rate. Strict radio discipline prevented surprise attacks. Ground-based radar guided Soviet fighters into perfect intercept positions. The layered altitude, bookshelf formation gave Soviet pilots multiple engagement opportunities. And intensive group training emphasized teamwork instead of individual heroics. Together, these factors turned the P-39 in Soviet service into a completely different weapon than the aircraft Britain and the United States had rejected. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters to P-39s at rates not seen earlier in the war. Veteran German pilots who had amassed dozens of kills against older Soviet aircraft were now being shot down by Airacobras. On September 21, 1943, Pokrishkin shot down 3 Ju-88 bombers in a single low-altitude attack. The engagement was observed by Soviet troops and war correspondents, further increasing his reputation. The achievement was impressive not just for the kill count, but because it demonstrated the P-39's ability to engage multiple targets rapidly and decisively. Throughout the autumn of 1943, Soviet P-39 units continued to succeed. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, now fully equipped with Airacobras, became one of the most feared Soviet fighter units on the Eastern Front. German pilots learned to recognize the distinct sound of the Allison engine and the appearance of Soviet Airacobras flying in formation. Unlike earlier in the war, when Soviet fighters often operated alone or in loose pairs, P-39 regiments flew in tight, coordinated groups with constant radio communication. Tactical innovation continued. Soviet pilots developed the pendulum patrol pattern, where fighters flew overlapping elliptical paths rather than straight courses. This maintained speed, prevented ambushes, and ensured continuous coverage of the airspace. This tactic was only possible with reliable radios and disciplined formations, both of which P-39 units possessed. The kill ratios reflect the change. In 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed Soviet aircraft at ratios of 5:1 or more. By early 1942, the ratio had fallen to around 3.1 in Germany's favor. By late 1943, after a year of P-39 operations, the ratio had approached 1:1. In some engagements, Soviet P-39 units began achieving positive kill ratios, destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This marked a fundamental turning point in the air war over the Eastern Front. It was not because German pilots had become less skilled. The Luftwaffe was still one of the most experienced and professional air forces in the world. But now they were facing Soviet pilots flying aircraft that finally matched German equipment, equipped with radios that enabled coordination, supported by training that emphasized teamwork and tactics, and armed with weapons capable of knocking down German fighters with a single burst. The P-39 gave Soviet pilots the tools they had always needed. Their aggression, skill, and determination were already there. No, they had a machine that allowed them to use those strengths fully. American pilots in the Pacific and European theaters never saw this potential. They flew P-39s in environments that highlighted its weaknesses, while giving no opportunity to use its strengths. High-altitude bomber escort required ceiling and climb performance the P-39 did not have. Long-range island operations required endurance the P-39 could not provide. Fighting Japanese Zeros at high altitude meant operating exactly where the P-39 performed worst. In those conditions, failure was unavoidable. The difference in tactical approaches was dramatic. American fighter doctrine emphasized individual initiative and aggressive pursuit. Pilots were trained to engage targets when opportunities arose and to press attacks until the enemy was destroyed or escaped. This worked with aircraft like the P-38 or P-47, which had enough performance and climb to recover from mistakes. But in the P-39, which often operated near the limits of its performance, aggressive solo action frequently led to disaster. Pilots who chased targets into disadvantageous positions could not disengage when threatened. Soviet fighter doctrine evolved in the opposite direction as the war continued. Early war tactics relied on large formations with poor coordination. Individual pilots had almost no autonomy and were expected to obey formation leaders rigidly. This approach collapsed in 1941, 1942. By 1943, Soviet doctrine had changed completely. Pilots were now trained to operate in coordinated pairs and flights with constant radio communication. Individual initiative was encouraged, but it was to be used within the structure of formation discipline. Pilots could adjust to immediate circumstances while still supporting their wingmen and remaining part of the tactical plan. This change matched the P-39's characteristics exactly. Its excellent radio made coordination easy. Its handling rewarded disciplined group maneuvering rather than reckless individual pursuit. Its concentrated forward firepower meant that coordinated attacks could destroy enemy aircraft quickly without prolonged dogfights. Prolonged turning fights were unnecessary. Soviet pilots shaped their tactics to match the aircraft, while American pilots had tried to force the aircraft to match their tactics. One method succeeded, the other failed. The difference extended to maintenance and technical support. Soviet mechanics, working under harsh field conditions, focused on weapon reliability and radio performance. They removed anything they considered unnecessary, such as the wing guns and certain armor panels, to improve handling where it mattered. American mechanics, bound by strict technical manuals, kept aircraft exactly to factory specifications, even when those specifications did not match combat needs. Soviet pilots had direct influence over how their fighters were configured, while American pilots had little input into modifications. In the Soviet environment, everything aligned perfectly. Combat took place at medium and low altitudes. Group tactics were supported by reliable radios. Ground support missions required tough aircraft with good visibility. German bombers operated at the same altitudes where the P-39 performed best. The P-39 was not transformed by Soviet use. It was simply used correctly for the first time. Pushkin ended the war with 59 confirmed victories. 47 of them scored in P-39s. This made him the second highest scoring Soviet ace and the highest scoring ace to fly any American-designed fighter. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times on May 24, 1943, August 24, 1943, and August 19, 1944. He also received 4 Orders of Lenin, the Order of the October Revolution, 4 Orders of the Red Banner, 2 Orders of Suvorov Second Class, 2 Orders of the Red Star, and the American Distinguished Service Medal. After the war, Pushkin remained in the Soviet Air Force, eventually rising to the rank of Marshal of Aviation. He retired in 1981 and died on November 13, 1985. At age 72, he never wavered from his belief that the P-39 was an outstanding fighter when employed properly. Several times during the war, Moscow requested his regiment transition to Soviet-built aircraft like the La-5 or Yak fighters. Pushkin refused these requests each time, choosing to continue flying his American fighters. Rechkalov scored 56 confirmed victories and 6 shared. He flew 452 combat sorties and took part in 122 air battles. He was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union twice, on May 24, 1943, and July 1, 1944. After the war, he graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1951, commanded several fighter units, and later became Deputy Commander of Fighter Aviation in the Far Eastern Air Defense Army in 1957. He achieved the rank of Major General of Aviation in 1959 and eventually retired. He wrote 2 books about his wartime experiences. Rechkalov passed away on December 20, 1990. At age 70, Lieutenant William Fiedler, the only American P-39 ace, is buried in a cemetery in Ohio. His service record lists 5 victories in the P-39 between January and June 1943. No American pilot surpassed that total in the aircraft. The contrast could not be clearer. 1 American ace, but dozens of Soviet aces. The difference was not pilot skill. American pilots were highly trained, aggressive, and capable. The difference was mission demands and tactical environment. The story of the P-39 is a story of context. Bell Aircraft originally designed it as a high-altitude interceptor to defend the American coastline. When the turbocharger was removed, the aircraft effectively became a medium-altitude fighter. Western air forces continued trying to use it as a high-altitude escort fighter, and it failed. The Soviet Air Force evaluated it at medium altitude, where it performed exceptionally well. The aircraft did not change. The way it was used did. On May 9, 1945, Soviet Captain Vasily Tsinyakov, flying an Airacobra, shot down a German Focke-Wulf FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft over Prague. This was the last aerial victory of World War II in Europe. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The P-39, the aircraft Western Air Forces had dismissed, scored the final kill of the European war. That same day, a German Me-262 jet shot down a P-39 over Bohemia, marking the Luftwaffe's final aerial victory of the conflict. The Airacobra had been present at the beginning of Lend-Lease deliveries to the USSR and was still in combat at the war's end. Soviet Airacobras continued flying until 1949, when the last operational regiments retired the type in favor of jet fighters. The aircraft served longer and more successfully in Soviet hands than it ever did in American or British service. After the war, American analysts studied Soviet use of the P-39 and found the conclusions difficult to accept. Some claimed Soviet pilots simply used different tactics. Others suggested that German fighters on the Eastern Front were inferior to those in the West. German archival records disproved this. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. The P-39 succeeded in Soviet service because it was used correctly. Mission requirements determined effectiveness, not inherent aircraft quality. Post-war interviews with Soviet pilots consistently praised the P-39. Rechkalov stated in a 1950s interview, "Of course, our fighters eventually reached parity with the German Air Force, but aircraft like the P-39Q were well balanced for combat." The most important advantage, in my opinion, was the highly sensitive radio. The radio in the Airacobra allowed us to communicate with our flightmates in any situation, as if speaking on a telephone beside us. Other pilots repeated the same point. The radio, more than any other feature, transformed Soviet fighter operations. The comparison to Soviet domestic fighters is revealing. The Yak series fighters were lighter and more maneuverable than the P-39. The LA-5 and LA-7 had better climb rates and similar speed, but neither matched the P-39's combination of firepower, reliable radio, durable airframe, and strong pilot protection. Soviet pilots who had flown both types generally preferred the American fighter for these reasons. The few Soviet aces who scored more victories in domestic fighters, such as Ivan Kozhedub, with 62 victories primarily in LA-5s and LA-7s, were exceptions that underscored the broader effectiveness of the P-39. Today, the P-39 Airacobra is remembered mostly as a failure in Western aviation history. Museums display it with notes about how it was rejected by American forces. Aviation enthusiasts often refer to it as the fighter nobody wanted. Books on World War II aircraft often mention it only briefly, focusing on its shortcomings. What these accounts rarely convey is the full story. More than 4,000 Soviet pilots flew P-39s in combat. They achieved around 3,000 confirmed victory claims, adjusted for known overcounting. They developed new tactics that reshaped air combat. On the Eastern Front, they demonstrated that understanding your equipment and using it correctly matters more than owning a theoretically superior machine used incorrectly. The lesson reaches far beyond aviation. Organizations often discard tools or methods that fail in one context without considering that they may excel in another. It is common and often wrong to assume that failure in one environment means failure everywhere. The P-39 failed for American and British forces because they needed capabilities it did not have. It succeeded for Soviet forces because it provided exactly what they needed. Both outcomes were predictable, based on mission profiles and tactical conditions. Soviet pilots who flew the P-39 regarded it as an excellent fighter, ideally suited to their missions. When you have scored 47 victories in an aircraft, when its radio coordination has saved your life repeatedly, when its cannon has destroyed enemy fighters with a single burst, you do not see a rejected design. You see a tool that worked perfectly for the task. That was the P-39's reality in Soviet service, a fighter that gave Soviet pilots technological parity with the Luftwaffe, heavy forward firepower, dependable communications, and durable structure. Combined with refined tactics and skilled pilots, these advantages helped achieve air superiority on the Eastern Front. The story matters because it illustrates a broader truth. Effectiveness depends on matching capabilities to requirements. It reminds us not to dismiss tools that fail in one situation without considering where they might succeed. It shows that different tactical environments demand different solutions. The P-39 taught these lessons. American and British forces learned them through frustration and disappointment. Soviet forces learned them through adaptation and success. The aircraft itself never changed, only the context around it did. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps us share more forgotten history from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected as we explore more untold stories. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to students to lifelong history lovers. You are part of something rare and valuable here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping preserve these stories.